So we're going to talk about the effect that communicators have on the bottom line. It's an evergreen topic in the communications industry. For as long as I've been covering this industry, the idea and the challenges around value creation and return on investment from communications have never gone away. And whilst I wouldn't suggest that we're going to solve everything, today's session, I'm really happy that we have such a vibrant panel, and it was described as a young panel. I think it was young until I brought the average age up. But it's great to see that we have some people from, who are bringing some new energy into the corporate communications function. So let me start with a sort of a general question, because I feel it's really important when we have these discussions that the definitions are clear. And we hear a lot of talk about the bottom line and about return on investment. And sometimes people look at that purely in terms of profitability or sales. And I suppose the risk there is that maybe that narrows the power of communications too much. So let's start there. And Indu, I'll start with you in no particular order. What do you think is the bottom line in terms of communications return on investment? And do you think this is being defined clearly enough?
Thanks for the question, Arun. And previously also when we were having discussion about it, this came again and again, actually. So in my view, you generally start a marriage and there are a lot of things you define in the beginning, here as well. When you come on board, it's very important that you have a discussion with your management as to what is really the bottom line and how do you define it. And in my view, today people are not buying products, people are buying brand purpose, the vision that we sell. Here, it's very important that you explain that today it's not only sales, it's a lot of other things that people are looking at. So the bottom line also been looked with a mix of all of those things. It should be reputation, it should be the brand purpose, value that you create, what you establish, the loyalty. And in the previous panel, we were listening to some of this, how CFOs also spoke about it, that in the times of crisis, how reputation are built, how loyalties come in front. So all those things have to be captured somewhere, and it cannot be an afterthought. It has to be defined in the very beginning. Otherwise, measurability will always be an issue. That's how I would rather say that.
Thank you. Latika, your perspective?
Again, I really agree with Indu here, and that's, I think, the biggest challenge that we as industry are facing in terms of how do you raise the standard of our matrix. And that is, I think, a journey that we have to undertake. And in my learning, we are a bastion of reputation when it comes to being at the juncture of product and services and marketing teams. So I think it's very important we work with them in defining some of the matrices. And what has worked well is also to move beyond the vanilla matrix. For example, beyond the share of voice. Because quite frankly, we just had a regional meeting of all the countries in Singapore, and it's become a joke because for every country, and I work with Mastercard currently, we were on top. So how do you go beyond that? And what has worked well is define 2-3 bigger projects, bigger themes that you're working at, and define the matrix for each one of them. For example, if you're working at building the visibility of a new product, define matrices on what are the articles that have come there, how many interviews have been featured, if there is a policy that you're looking at in terms of regulating, how is it that you have advocacy articles, how do you rate the quotes in the industry stories? So I think it's really about moving beyond the share of voice.
Towards a system of kind of multiple variables and metrics. Ruchica, curious to hear your perspective on this. How are you defining the bottom line?
Well, I think, yes, going back to the question itself is important because somewhere I think we need to lean in more on the craft that we've chosen to sort of work on. And I think our craft sits at the intersection of science and art. So there's a science part of it, which you can perhaps evaluate in numbers. You can perhaps even try to pigeonhole PR in very quantitative, salesy, marketing metrics, if you wish to. But the art part of it is what I think I would lean on. And that's where I think most of us spend a lot of time on. It is about messaging, it's about the medium, whatever creative execution we are doing, for our campaigns, all of those things. So when we look at all of that, I think there are two things that come to my mind. One, of course, is what is it that we're delivering to business when you're talking about bottom line? Obviously, businesses are looking at how they are maximizing their revenue or profitability. But we are working on providing a very, very significant moat to business, which is around the reputation of the business, right? And it's you have to have a long-term view on that. So when you sit down with business, be it during the time of your budget and planning, or even during your interview with businesses when they are hiring you to lead their CopCom, I think it's important to have that conversation. What do they really expect PR to drive for the company? And when you have started your conversation from there, you're setting goals for yourself of the kind which are measurable, but at the same time, you have the buy-in from business that you are setting it up for the long term in a way and manner. For that matter, I think we dread the sales word a lot. I think all functions in any corporate exist for sales, including HR and PR. But that isn't the only thing we do. Ultimately, it could drive that. The brand love also drives sales, right? Whatever moniker you may choose to use, I think it's really important that we're not shying away from putting the numbers, the ones that you can, but we also put it out there that the work that we do, PR perhaps doesn't even explain the extent of our work, because I think we are working in very different areas, we're collaborating cross-functionally to deliver value to business. So somewhere that needs to be identified, that needs to be put front and center when we are sort of talking about what we're going to deliver through the year. And from there, you can you can talk about outcomes, you can talk about OKRs or KPIs or whatever you have, but the conversation has to begin where we talk about how we're building reputation, which has to be a sustainable long-term goal.
Okay, thank you. And Shikha, at TripAdvisor, how are you defining value creation in terms of communications?
So I think I'm glad that I work with TripAdvisor, which is a brand which has been built purely on PR. We've never historically done advertising. We do not do a lot of marketing. So I think it was critical, and it is critical for the top boss to own PR and communications, because that's the way that you're going to be driving any brand which has been created. And to come back to your question, if you look at the bottom line, it cannot be narrowly defined only as sales. Had that been the case, there would have been many brands which would have failed, right? So clearly what we bring to the table is a lot more than just PR. There's a lot more. There's I would echo what my other co-panelists have said. We are creating brand. We are creating value. It is not an over thing. It's not something that happens overnight. And I think when you sit down with the top management and you set the expectations, irrespective of what they expect of you, you need to bring in this perspective to them. A lot of them, they do not understand what communications is, what PR is, what is it that we can do. It is our job to make it very, very clear to them. Where is it that we can come in? What is it that we can own? To what extent? And more importantly, how we will measure it and over what period of time. So I think that's something which is very critical to have, the transparency between the comms team and the top, the top management.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, Suniet, tell us about your experiences at Deloitte.
Sure. First of all, I'm pleased to be in the company of four women, considering tomorrow is International Women's Day. So
Lovely women.
Thank you for putting me in this panel. Well, I guess I'm the only one who's actually in the B2B industry here, considering the rest of here are in the B2C industry. To me, being in the firm, it seems the intangibles matter a lot than the tangibles. The relationships that we build over a period of time through our efforts through corporate communications and PR. The intrinsic value that we bring to talent, to society, to clients, the brand recall that we have every time for our brand is something that I would consider to be the most valuable proposition while determining the bottom line. So that's how I'd like to define the bottom line.
Okay, interesting. So I'm getting a sense here that there are things you can measure, and there may be some things that you can't. Right, so perhaps I could ask the room, because it's interesting to hear the views. How many of you in the room think that everything you do can be measured? Okay, good. Oh, one person who works in measurement. Well, that makes sense. How many of you think that there are things that you do that just cannot be measured, that are intangible, perhaps? Okay. And the rest of you don't care? So I suppose the next question, perhaps, is, and I'll put this to the panel, is there a risk for you, for your function, especially when we're talking about getting these budgets, because you're competing, perhaps, with other functions within an organization for a finite amount of resources? Is there a risk where there are activities which can't be measured, where you can't prove the success? Does that perhaps leave you a little bit exposed? Indu?
I would say this is tied back to the previous question. If you have defined it well, you will not sit in a situation like that. We have to de-jargonize when we speak. There's a lot of work which we do, which we think cannot be measured. Actually, it can be. If we start speaking the language that the business is speaking, if the business says that for us what matters is a net revenue, which is NR. So why can't we go back to and say that we are supporting 100% of NR, and if these are the 5 new NPDs or brand launches that are going to come, see, in a very systematic fashion, these are the 5 things I'm going to do, and this is how it's going to impact your new launches. Or this is how it's going to impact the business. And the 100 crore or whatever expectation that the business helps, how are you going to fit into that conversation? Problem is, what we also discussed that other day is FO, which is fear of finding out. We don't want to stand up and say that this is what I'm going to do. We want to talk in our own language while we're sitting in an alien environment where nobody understands PR, what my friends here also said. We need to educate people about what we are doing. So we need to talk their language and not our own. And once you start doing that, people will listen to what you're saying. And then you will be much more impactful, measurable, and understood pretty well. So that is something I would say that we should be doing. And if you are doing that, and if you have defined with the business in the beginning that you're going to have 5 launches in a year or whatever, and these are the things I'm going to support that for your business, these are new launches, and if you have certain plans for this year or the 5 years to come, then this is the kind of thing that is on business. Because I would say that at least in an FMCG space, broadly there are 2 buckets that you're working for. One is the brand and the product, which is very sales focused in its own way. And one is long-term, which is the reputation building, which then can be measured with the brand scores and a lot of other third-party things that you do. But very importantly, people look at with close eye on what are you supporting the business for. So that is something that you need to define in the beginning. And if the definition is right, if the metrics are right, and people agree upon it, then I don't think there is anything stopping you.
Okay, so some really interesting points there. We'll talk about this idea of FOFO, fear of finding out, perhaps in a little bit. But Latika, I'll come to you next. Does it concern you at all if there are things that can't be measured?
Well, I'm working in an organization which is quite buoyant about the marketing and communications. So I'm not really facing any issue at present. But I do agree that it is a crisis that happens in the organization which makes it realize the impact that the communication can have on the business sales. So what ideally is important is before you're working on any campaign, and it's the key to realize the business areas of focus and align few activities which are basis on those areas of focus. So do get 3-4 themes in your tactical campaign that focus on business goals. So that way you can address the fear, as you're saying, of finding out. And that gets you more aligned to the business, makes you more aligned to the reality of the organization in the current scenario.
Ruchica, your take?
Well, I so wish businesses really didn't have to incur any sort of reputation cost to figure out that reputation does have a business cost. But a lot of brands find out that's the only way for them to find out that we should care for reputation. And it's not something you can build when there's crisis. It's something that you have built over a period of time. But be that as it may, I think it's really important. Like I said, we have to do advocacy for the work that we do. That's super important. And that doesn't just only sit outside of where you work, expecting everybody within the organization. When you're in a corporate setup, not a lot of people actually know what all you do and what all does your work encompass. So I think that kind of advocacy is super important, not just with the CEO or the CFO or whoever else you may be reporting into, but at the same time with a lot of peers, just so they understand your work better. And I think we all have heard it at some point of time where people do not quite get that, yeah, well, some warm, fuzzy feeling about, we are good, we are doing something for the reputation, but I can't really measure it or know what value you've actually added to business. So, like I said, I think it's a whole lot of advocacy. It sometimes could make some of us, it could be unsettling sometimes when you have done something good, but there isn't a way to measure and show impact of that. And I think that's where I would lean in more on the art part of our business rather than the science part of our business to help them see value in what we've driven.
It's interesting that the crisis angle has come out here because that's something that is hard to quantify. Shikha, maybe I'll come to you next. I mean, how hard is it when you can't necessarily quantify what the cost is to a reputation from a crisis?
Look, anything that you're not able to answer very, in a very straightforward manner is unsettling for all of us. And be it measurement, be it, could be a failed campaign. So, but I think largely we can try and measure any and every activity that we're doing. If, like we've already discussed, we define what is it that we aim to get out of it. There could be a set benchmark, there could be a variable as well, that you could very upfrontly tell, the team that you're working with. So that makes your job a lot easier. When you're talking about crisis, and that's when the entire reputation bit comes into place, you have to be very cognizant that in today's digital age, anything and everything can just blow out of proportion. And even if there's a crisis in the social media space, while you may have someone else handling social media, but it is the comms team that needs to drive all the communication so that it doesn't spiral out of hand. The company has to speak as one. And clearly that's something that can be measured. Maggie is a classic example. It's been a 360 degrees approach and you've been able to measure how the brand has turned itself around. Multiple ways that you can measure, but there could be certain instances where you may have certain amount of a non-measurable sort of variable. But that's all right. I think that's something that we can deal with.
And Suniet, I mean, does it concern you at all if you're unable to get to those results that can be quantified?
Absolutely. Actually, I'll just, I'm recollecting this article that I read by Paul Holmes, in fact. And Paul was in a conference, I guess, in London 30 years back, and this was what was discussed, and we are still discussing it today. So I don't know whether we'll be getting to that answer, but yes, I would agree to what my colleagues here say, that at the time of the crisis is when, the real value of PR comes out and how we define PR comes out. And more so, I would say, again, I'll go back to the point that I made in the beginning, is about the relationships that we build with external stakeholders, be it media, be it with the regulators. All those, again, matter. And those are only fostered and facilitated by the PR or the Corpcom team. So crisis, as we all know, it makes or breaks a brand. So it's essential that we use this as an opportunity to showcase how important PR and Corpcom is to the leadership.
Yeah, so you mentioned the article Paul Holmes wrote and this idea of fear of finding out. So I'll just mention some of the stats from that article. So this was research conducted in the US, so some relevance. This is, by the way, in-house research. So 94% of respondents said they had little or no reliable understanding of the quantifiable business value actually delivered by marketing and communications. 97% said they had little or no idea how much money they should be investing in marketing and PR. 95% said they doubted whether marketing leaders have the same understanding of value creation as business leaders. And 92% said that they were not sure that marketing leaders understood the range of business problems that need to be solved. So those numbers are really damning, actually. But I think and then, of course, that gives rise to this notion, perhaps, that the industry as a whole has a fear of proving its value, or at least a fear of finding out what that value is, and would rather prefer a situation where, you know, ignorance almost is bliss. If you don't have to prove you've been successful, you won't be exposed for failing. Do you feel that is a risk at all, Indu?
If someone is in that situation, that is risky, definitely. I wouldn't disagree to something like that. But I think it's all about, you know, what you have done in the course of your career and, you know, how you have been defining your work. But previously also when we had the discussion, I said the same thing, that one thing I would agree here on the stage, and I'm assuming many others might agree or disagree to that, the environment has evolved, the profession has also evolved, but the measurement metrics are somewhere lagging behind. You know, we need to still work upon that, and which is why we are still having these discussions, which is something we all need to work together and come up with something which is much more agreeable. And in my view, that will happen only once we understand what a business is and not only what communications is. You know, because we are working for the business. We are not working only for ourselves, which is where this definition of understanding what the business is doing, what the marketing is doing, what overall business wants from us. And in the previous CFO panels also, we heard that they said that if somebody can understand my pain points and give me relevant solutions, is when the communicator is, you know, so close to me. So we need to understand what is really happening around us and not look inwards. We should look outwards. And once that marriage happens is when we will be a little more successful and at ease. But that's something which is in the process, hasn't arrived so far. But we are in a good place because today we are able to have that conversation. We are not like a second cousin to advertising, but we are, you know, today in equal conversation with them, and people are looking up to PR. You know, why are people asking us this question? Why are CMO today is asking that, how do I measure you? Because they in their minds think you are very valuable, but how do they define it as a question? So that is where the, you know, the flux is. That's something that we can only solve. Neither a marketer nor a salesperson can do it for us. Which is where in the beginning, when you're defining your roles, your goals, stop, you know, being in a quiet and being in your cocoon and saying, okay, whatever you define for me is fine. No, you should be the guy who should be standing and saying, these are the 5 things I will do, and this is how I can impact it. Otherwise, somebody else will always be in charge of what you're doing in your career or at a workplace. The day that stops, the day you are telling it to the others, things will change.
Arun, can I just come in here with a point?
Please, yeah.
Slightly different perspective, but I feel that the leadership has also kind of changed its views about how important PR or corporate communication should be. And not necessarily, you know, put that whole analytics bit to determine as to whether the team needs to grow or whether, you know, it needs to have more power. Interestingly, Atul and Richa had shown this really nice presentation, and I go with that whole point. I think you've mentioned 40% of the CFOs believe in now looking at that social angle and the fact that, you know, PR and Corpcom is important. So I think increasingly that belief is going up and not necessarily determined by the bottom line, how important that is. I can say it for example, in my own organization, 2 years back, we were 15 people, today we are 13 people. So, which means that the belief in PR or the fact that, you know, the brand needs to be looked at very, very significantly has grown up.
So there's just a more implicit understanding at the C-suite level of the value of PR. Right, yeah. Indu, you mentioned the importance of defining the value ourselves rather than letting someone else define it, which I think is really important. You also talked about metrics. Maybe I'll come to the rest of you on that, because that's always a somewhat controversial topic. You know, the industry has grown up unfortunately perhaps, using these kind of metrics for volume. So whether that's reach, whether that's awareness, and these are sort of, these metrics for volume have become a proxy for the value of communications. Latika, how important for you is it that perhaps we move beyond those types of metrics?
So as I mentioned before, I think it's very, very important. As we call it, the vanilla metrics, share of voice, reach, and also tweak as the need of the organization changes. For example, being aware that being on Twitter necessarily would not mean the number of followers. And in the phase of your journey in the organization, which ones to focus on, whether it has to be a number of followers, its engagement. So really understanding, first getting the clarity of what is required at the beginning of the campaign, rather than, doing the entire cycle of work, and then when the review time comes, you start focusing on the matrix. So it's very, very important we put the outcomes first in place, get the alignment from the leadership team, and really focusing on things which also drive, and maybe I'm going to say something controversial here. You have to show the ROI. And that's increasingly, it's not, I wouldn't call it the fear of finding out, it's the fear of not being able to speak out, to ask the leadership what is their expectations out of PR. So really defining those for yourself and changing those metrics as need be.
Okay. Ruchica?
I think in a lighter way, in this fear of finding out, I loved reading that article. You had suggested reading that. But I had an interesting take on it. I think it's the joy of missing out. So we can look at JOMO maybe. Just the joy of missing out on the numbers, charts, and graphs. I think it's delightful. Not to everybody, but to me for sure. Not a lover of numbers. But at the same time, I think it's important. Yes, return on investment is important to everybody, right? Not just for the CFOs or any of the other business functions that have actually got to show, the incremental value that they've earned for business over the investment that was made into them. So I think somewhere setting those rules, I think what Indu said right at the start, it can't be an afterthought. It's a conversation to be had before you set out to, set out with your plan for the year or your quarterly or half-yearly plan, or even a job offer that you may be taking up. It's first the understanding that you need to have with business on what is it that they expect PR to drive, what is it that you can help drive. If communications is a strategic function to business, because reputation, like I said, has a business cost, then you need to have alignment on some of these things, that these are things that I could measure for you. Some of these are vanity metrics. I may not even believe in it, but if you do, yes, please, we will go for it. But there are a lot of other ways in which we can look at how we have done. How easy is it to really measure influence? I don't think it's that easy, right? You write an opinion piece in the Times of India, or you write one in the Business Standard. Different value, different mediums, why you've chosen one over the other. I think those again, I think the onus is on us as message bearers to help explain that in a way and manner that they can understand. And not just by, again, like Indu said, by jargonizing it, but by some plain speak, by helping people understand why this medium may be important, why what we have done may be more influential than what perhaps some in the other functions may have suggested. So I think I'll again come back to the point of advocacy. It's really important we do advocacy for the kind of work we do.
Okay, good point. And Shikha, how have you found perhaps that challenge in terms of moving beyond some of those traditional metrics?
At least at TripAdvisor, I can say we're fairly, forward-looking. And I've never really faced any problems as such. I think the organization looks to us to define what is it that we want and how we would want to drive it. And again, coming to your point of ROI, everything has to be ROI driven. Reason why I'm saying is because you're putting your own time, effort, energy into it. Wouldn't you want to measure it for your own self, right? If you're doing anything. So why should it be any different? And when the business is giving you a budget, you're running with a budget, you have to be answerable. So I think that's very important. You have to set certain objectives for yourself and work towards them. Be very clear, be very transparent, why you're choosing one medium over the other. So I think we're all fairly on equal footing here. We echo the same sentiment. When it comes to measurement, I'd be happy to know how the other companies, how various regions are innovating. Great to know, to learn, maybe imbibe and start using them. Like I said, certain things, maybe when it comes to online, you're able to probably, in today's time, measure a lot more, in a lot more concrete fashion than what you would probably be able to measure otherwise. I mean, offline, of course, we know the circulation and XYZ figures. But the real message, has it actually gone to your end consumers? You may choose a publication over the other. The message that you want to drive, and to what extent has that message gone to your consumers? It has been taken in, it has been understood, whether it is B2B, whether it is B2C. So again, be very clear, be very transparent, be very upfront. You have to set up your own measurement systems and get a buy-in from the top level. Once that's in, I think you're good to roll. And ROI, definitely, it has to be there. You can't like not work within ROI.
Okay, Amit's shaking his head at me, which I think means that we're running out of time. Okay, so I'm just going to ask the panel very quickly. Indu, you said you had a great question. You should moderate this panel, by the way. You had a great question. You said your CEO asked you, how do I measure your value? So if I can ask each of you very quickly, one sentence from each of you in answer to that question that everyone in the room can use when your CEO asks you, how do I measure your value? I'll start with you, Indu.
You should be able to say that I am here for all your functions. I'm here for your marketing, for your sales. In your marketing, I'm helping your path to purchase. In your sales, I'm building the, even the need of your product, because people know you through me, through my efforts. I'm helping your CFOs and your HR by building a culture, by helping them out speak their own things. And with all of this, I'm building a reputation for you for the years to come.
Great. Latika?
I would say that I'm helping you build trust. I think in these times of serious trust deficit, that's what I'm focusing on, internally and externally for Mastercard, yes.
Okay. Ruchica?
I think I'd say I'm building another very significant and sustainable moat for your business, which is around reputation.
Shikha?
I think I'll echo what the business objective is, right? Which is with the largest travel site in the world. And how am I doing that with a 360-degree approach? It cannot be just one function, talking one language. It has to be all the functions. And they need to understand that they have to speak in one language. It can't be the other way around. And if you're able to control that and drive that, that's something which is going to be a win.
Okay. Suniet?
Trusted advisor to your business, to what you want to do in terms of internal and external communications. So quite close to what Latika was saying. No wonder we have the same PR agency.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Can you... Oh, I'm afraid we don't have time for audience Q&A. I think we're going to... Yeah, at lunch break. Sorry, I'm under strict instructions, Sandeep. I'm sorry. I'll hand back to Anubhati. Can you please join me in thanking a wonderful panel today discussing a very difficult topic.
Thank you.